Bloomberg Audio Studios.
Podcasts, radio, news.
This is a moment of fundamental choice for Britain. I have made my choices, the responsible choices, to restore stability to our country, to protect working people. More teachers in our schools, more appointments in our NHS, more homes being built, fixing the foundations of our economy, investing in our future, delivering change, rebuilding Britain. We, on these benches, commend those choices, and I commend this statement to the House.
Chancellor Rachel Reeves, the first woman to deliver the budget speech in the office's more than 800-year history. And what a budget. Let's get into it. This is Bloomberg UK Politics. I'm Stephen Carroll.
And I'm Yuan. Welcome to our special coverage of the Labour government's first budget in 14 years.
All has been revealed. Rachel Reeves has told us her plans. Let's get into some of the announcements. And there were a lot of them. In terms of taxes, UK taxes going up by £40 billion. That is a amount that we haven't seen in equivalence since the last government in 1993. Conservative Norman Lamont was Chancellor then. And we're looking at a range of taxes going up. We'll start with some of those. Increasing employers' national insurance contributions going up by 1.2 percentage points from April of next year. So that's going to be a big increase in costs for employers. They've also reduced the threshold up after which that applies as well. That's going to raise £25 billion a year. Some carve-outs for small businesses had been flagged in advance. Lots of business groups we know not very happy about that. Capital gains tax going up as well. The higher rate going up to 24%, the lower rate going up to 18%. No change to the capital gains tax on residences. Again, that was vaguely in line with what we had been expecting running into this as well. A particular change affecting the private equity industry. Private equity managers will now have to pay 32% tax on their carried interest gains from next year. So that's an increase from the current 28% capital gains tax they currently pay on those profits made on asset sales. Chancellor also promising more changes to that regime from April 2026. Some changes to inheritance tax. Inherited pensions are going to come into inheritance tax from 2027, and the UK will now apply the 50% relief on inheritance tax for AIM shares as well. So that's going to be an interesting move affecting part of the financial markets too. And as promised, the non-dom tax regime being abolished as well. They're going to remove the concept of domicile from April 2025 and shift to a residence-based scheme. Those are some of the taxes that are going up.
Yeah, interestingly, on the non-dom things, he didn't mention the inheritance tax, whether that would be affected. I'm interested to speak to our guest in a moment about on that, John Stepek. But yeah, that's a key thing which I don't think we heard about in the non-dom changes, which a lot of people were watching out for. Just on the wider spending changes, a 1.5% real terms growth in public spending after 2025. That is the key number. It doesn't sound like much, but that's quite a change from what the Tories were planning, which was a 1% real terms growth. But this is still a really, really tight settlement on public spending. It means that a lot of departmental budgets will continue to be very, very squeezed over the next few years. Key number from the Treasury document, the budget increases total spending by £74 billion by 2030. And just going through some of the investment plans, this, of course, a big part of the budget. Rachel Reeves saying that invest. The key thing she wants the budget to be. You're
playing with your Guess Who game as well. Of like, oh, look, yes, we're expecting that one. Go on.
Yeah, very much so. Yeah. And of course, channeling a little bit of Tony Blair with education. Much more difficult to say. And on the investment front, £100 billion in capital spending over the next 5 years. That is the key top line from the Chancellor. And
something that she says the OBR is forecasting that's going to drive growth and longer term increase GDP by up to 1.4%. Part of the justification, of course, for the big spend.
Yeah, should be hopeful that comes true. Interesting to see some of the projects that she allocated for the capital spending. A lot of money for green projects, a lot of nodding from Ed Miliband, looking very pleased. Listening into the budget statement. Green hydrogen, a number of projects there, saying that some of those will be the first commercial green hydrogen projects in the world. Money for school building and, of course, money for capital spending in the NHS, as you'd expect.
Yeah, and look, the increase in NHS funding is huge. £22.6 billion in the day-to-day day-to-day health budgets. That's going to be a big increase. What the Chancellor described as the largest real terms growth in day-to-day spending outside of COVID since 2010 as well. Of course, the goal of that to do things like bringing down waiting lists. They're trying to get to that 18-week target. Of course, those are goals are going to be quite difficult to achieve. So an interesting move on both the day-to-day spending in the NHS, but also on some of the capital issues, both for schools and hospitals. Actually, RAC came up on both of those as well. Of course, that's the brick material. There's been all these problems with about the structural integrity of some of these buildings. So announcements from the Chancellor from that as well. Going back briefly to tax, Yuan, because there were a couple of things that didn't change, and there were a couple of moments where we all sort of held our breath thinking, oh, here we go, something's going to happen, and then it didn't. One is the fuel duty freeze is continuing for another year. There had been a question about whether or not the fuel duty would go up in the reversing previous cuts, but essentially would go up from next year, but it's going to be frozen.
Yeah, quite significant that actually. Interestingly, that the REC, rather surprisingly, were calling for the cut to be reversed. You wouldn't expect that from a motoring organisation, but they say that retailers have just been padding their margins with this tax cut. So even the motoring organisations were saying perhaps it was time to get rid of the cut. Remember that the fuel duty has been frozen since 2011, an unprecedentedly long time that motorists haven't had to pay extra tax on their fuel. And this was something that many people speculated that Labour would finally change. It's a very expensive thing to maintain, but they have kept it going.
And one other plan that's not changing either is that the freeze on income tax thresholds will end in 28-29. So we will see an uprating of the income tax thresholds, from something we've been watching closely as well.
Well, let's bring in John Stepek from our personal finance team, writer of the Money Distilled newsletter, which is a favourite, of course, for us here on the podcast. John, what's your reaction to the measures we saw in this long budget from the Chancellor?
I mean, I think my reaction will be the same as almost everyone else's, which is that it could have been worse. And I think that was obviously deliberate by Rachel Reeves and also the wider party. And basically everything that happened was telegraphed as being potentially much worse than it actually was. The one and only thing is employer national insurance. That's a pretty chunky hike. And I think that'll be the thing to watch, because you got that on top of a big rise in minimum wage as well. We're currently at a cyclical upturn in the UK, which probably can be coped with, but I think that's a big pressure on small businesses. And in the long run, although it's sticking to the letter of the manifesto, it's not the spirit, because at the end of the day that gets chewed up out of future wages, future pension contributions. So I think that's the one to keep an eye on. The rest of the stuff, I mean, inheritance tax, I mean, it's interesting. I think the markets are having a relief rally. You get FTSE 250s going up. You get AIM recovering, because on the inheritance tax side with AIM, the concern was that she would get rid of, basically just apply 40% across the board. As it is, it sounds like it's going to be 20%, and it's probably going to be 20% over £1 million. So there's not the same reason to yank all your money out of AIM, because there is still a tax break there, and I think that was important to that segment of the market. And I mean, capital gains tax, again,
sort of in line with what we were expecting.
Aye, they talked about higher numbers. I mean, the only thing with capital gains tax is obviously it's capital gains is a very tricky one, and if we wanted to make it a proper revenue source, it would require an awful lot more thought and time and reform than I think realistically they had time for.
Do you think she's played a bit of a blinder with capital gains tax? Of course, by talking up the chances of a big raise, lots of people would have sold assets over the summer, bringing in lots of tax revenue.
Yeah, no, it's definitely going to make the public finances look better. I mean, the other thing that she didn't touch was pensions, really. I mean, inheritance tax and defined contribution pensions was always a slightly weird loophole, and one that I remember. I'm old enough to remember when it wasn't considered a good idea, actually, to use it for tax planning, because when it first happened, it seemed like such a odd outcome that most financial advisors assumed it would be shut down within months of it originally happening. And it's only in the last kind of 5 or 6 years, I would say, that people have got used to it being there as a tax planning tool. So that shutting down is not that much of a surprise. It will be a bit fiddly because of the legalities around trusts, etc., but that's just a detail.
But interesting on the broader pensions reforms, lots of things that were mooted earlier in the summer just didn't happen at all.
Yeah. And I mean, most of those things, I can see why they weren't introduced because they've been very complicated. You can't really flatten tax relief without damaging public sector pensions, and there's no way that she would pick that fight. And as far as, the employer NI, they were talking about introducing that on pensions, but instead they just put it up.
Yeah.
And actually, one good thing about that from a personal finance point of view is if you're someone who uses salary sacrifice to avoid being bumped into one of those ridiculous marginal rates, which are still intact, unfortunately, then that will still work for you. So that's a good thing, and I'm glad that she didn't introduce employer NI on pensions specifically, because that would have been basically quite unfair.
Okay, let's bring in our chief UK economist, Dan Hanson, who's also been poring through some of the details as well. Dan, I wanted to talk a little bit about what the overall package looks like. So 40 billion increase in taxes, 100 billion in capital spending, and the headroom, interestingly, quite low under the new debt target, £15.7 billion. What did you make of kind of the big numbers that come out of this?
I've actually been hugely surprised. I think I would go as far as to say they've, as you say, about 35-40 billion pounds in tax, 70 plus billion pounds in extra spending, so a 30 billion-ish pound increase in borrowing, significant increase in borrowing, a significant near-term fiscal loosening. So if you're sitting in Threadneedle Street, you're going to be worried about this in terms of how quickly you're going to be lowering interest rates.
Because it looks inflationary.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. I mean, if you look at some of the charts in the OBR, they've really boosted their CPI forecast for a number of reasons. Some of the direct impacts of some of the duties on the CPI forecast, but some of it is because they think the policy package will push the economy to overheat. So there's this big near-term demand boost in there that the bank will be interested in and sort of have to think about. I think in the medium term, it's probably even more interesting given the government's narrative. You have this boost from capital spending, so you get a bigger economy because there are basically more machines in the economy that we can all use and we're more productive. They take away from the supply capacity of the economy through higher employer NICs because it passes through to wages and that affects the incentives to work. And the final thing the OBR have said, which is completely against Reeves' narrative, is that it crowds out private investment, doesn't crowd it in. Why? Because interest rates are higher as a result of this policy package. So there's a chart in box, such a OBR nerd, but in box
we love it.
Box 2.1.
Please turn to box 2.1 in your worksheets.
Well, if you want the killer chart, box 2.1 in the OBR's document, chart B.
Yeah,
and if you have a look at that, it tells.
This podcast doesn't come with footnotes, Dan.
No, well, that's what I'm here for. It's really interesting how. So in the medium term, over 5 years, the policy package actually makes the economy just slightly smaller. But because the OBR is looking now out over 10 years, the economy is, that sort of effect does unwind slightly. So 10 years, the economy is just marginally bigger. So it's really interesting.
Interesting. Market bets and Bank of England haven't shifted that much at the back of that either. Is that because they haven't read that far down the document yet?
Well, they're not. Yeah, they've got better things to do than me. But I think, a couple of things. The OBR make a point in their introductory paragraph that they have made an assumption that bank rate will be 25 basis points higher permanently because of this policy package, and they say that's sort of broadly in line with the movements we had in gilt yields and bank expectations in the run-up to the fiscal event, in the run-up to today. Because remember, the OBR take a snapshot of the interest rate curve a long way back. They took it back in September, I think. So obviously today we had a rally in gilts, so some of that's unwound. What'll be interesting to see as this gets digested and how the bank interprets this as to whether we see some of that unwind, basically that rally in gilts that we've seen today, because it seems to me that this is a near-term fiscal loosening that will catch their attention.
John, it was a budget that was quite short on rabbits, wasn't it? But just give us a couple of your personal
my rabbit count was almost zero.
It was a very low rabbit count. A bit of rabbit on stamp duty, wasn't there?
Yeah, well, I think I wouldn't necessarily call that a rabbit so much as a kind of rabid rabbit. It's I think putting I don't get it wrong. I mean, I think that the direction of travel has been very clear on property for a long time, and I think if you're someone who still views residential property as a viable investment for an amateur in person, or even as an investment asset, you maybe need to have a look at what's happened over the last 10 years, because the tax benefits have been slashed. This latest move, jacking up the stamp duty again, is just it's sort of signalling we don't want people to own second homes, and that's before you get to local council taxes in various desirable areas. I mean, the other rabbit obviously is basically saying
things that didn't happen.
We'll defrost the tax thresholds in 2028, 2029. But of course, she's got 5 years to change her mind to put that.
Yes, it's a long way off.
Okay, John Stepek, who writes our Money Distilled newsletter, and our chief UK economist, Dan Hanson, thank you very much for bringing us your instant analysis of this budget, the first under the new Labour government and the first delivered by a female Chancellor in the 800-year history. That's it from us for today. If you like the programme, don't forget to subscribe. Give it 5 stars so other people can find it on Apple Podcasts, Spotify or wherever you listen.
This episode was produced by James Walcock and Tiwa Adebayo, and our audio engineer was Sean Gostamakia. I'm Yuan Potts.
And I'm Stephen Carroll. We'll be back with more tomorrow. This is Bloomberg.
Bloomberg UK Politics. Listen weekdays at noon on DAB Digital Radio in London.